AFNA sound test 2.
I'd like to call the meeting to order and let folks know that the meeting is now live. This is the February 16th, 2023 meeting of the Audit Finance Administration Committee. My name is Councillor Cameron Kretsch. I'll be chairing. I'm just going to go through who's in the room. Councillor Jeff Beattie, Councillor Brad Clark, Councillor Tammy Huang, Councillor Mark Taddison, and joining us on the WebEx, Councillor Alex Wilson. And just for those who are in the room to know what staff are here, I'm just going to go down the row. City Auditor Charles Brown, Deputy City Auditor Bridget Menard, Executive Director Laura Fontana, General Manager Mike Zagaric, City Manager Jeanette Smith, General Manager Carlisle Can, and Director of Government Relations and Community Engagement Morgan Stahl. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived in the city's website. Other individuals in the media may also be audibly and are visually recording this meeting. All electronic devices are to be switched to a non-audible function during committee meetings, and members are reminded of the 5-minute time limit, which will be adhered to during this meeting. Members can submit another request to speak if they require more time to ask questions or make comments. Just want to let you know I'll be timing you based on the length of time you use to ask questions, not on the answers that are provided to you. And I'll be keeping track here. Also just want to flag at the beginning of this meeting before we start that there is the Emergency and Community Services meeting today starting at 1:30. And so I'm going to be trying to keep us moving along so we can get out of here in time for that. Obviously, we've experienced the going late and what the consequences of that are. So we'll try and our best to keep this moving at a certain pace. We're on now to the approval of the agenda, which is item 2. Legislative Coordinator Bates, are there any changes to the agenda?
Yes, Mr. Chair, there are several changes to the agenda. We have one added communication item under item 5. It's 5.2 from Gabriel Nicholson respecting motion 11.2, council access to and copies of confidential records. The recommendation is that it be received and referred to consideration of item 11.2, council access to and copies of confidential records. We also have under item 8 a presentation 8.2. The Committee Against Racism will be presenting their annual report. There's no copy for that item. Under item 9, consent items, we have 9.4, the Committee Against Racism minutes from January 10th, 2023. And item 10, discussion items, we have added discussion item 10.2, the Committee Against Racism Citizen Committee report respecting citizen candidates for the Hamilton Police Services Board Selection Committee. We will also refer to item 14.1 for the confidential Appendix A to that report. And also added to the agenda is under item 14, private and confidential, is the aforementioned confidential Appendix A as 14.1. That's confidential Appendix A to the Committee Against Racism Citizen Committee report respecting citizen candidates for the Hamilton Police Services Board Selection Committee.
Thank you very much for letting us know about those changes. I will briefly talk to the discussion item when we get there, but I just wanted to make folks aware that it's really important that you look at that private and confidential bit because it directly relates to this in terms of who specifically that is being recommended. So may I please have a mover and seconder to approve the agenda as amended? Seeing Councillor Huang and then Councillor Taddison, is there any discussion on the agenda as amended? I'm not seeing any, and hoping we're all logged into the eScribe system. We're going to vote. Vote number 1. The vote should be up on your screen now. That motion carries 6-0. We're on to item 3, which are declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest from members of the committee? Looking around, seeing none. Okay, thank you so much. We'll move on to item 4, which is the approval of the minutes of our previous meeting. And that meeting was February the 2nd, 2023. That's item 4.1 on the agenda. Can I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the minutes of the February 2nd, 2023 meeting? I see Councillor Huang as a mover and see Councillor Alex Wilson as a seconder. Is there any discussion on the approval of the minutes? Not seeing any vigorous discussion on the minutes, we will move to the second electronic vote. And that motion carries 6-0. Now on to communication items, item 5. And there we have items 5.1 and 5.2, as you can see at the agenda. Can I please have a mover and seconder to approve the communications 5.1 and 5.2 as presented? Moved by Councillor Huang and seconded by Councillor Taddison. Is there any discussion on the approval of these communication items? I'm going to speak briefly to one of them. Councillor Huang, if you wouldn't mind taking the chair just before we vote on that.
Go ahead.
Thanks. I want to speak to the first one, and this isn't the first resignation we've seen already in this term of council, and I want to make sure it's read out there, the reason why the person is reading, and it's here on the public record, but it's a lack of integration of new members into the committee discussions, a general lack of new member orientation upon joining. Improvements could be made in the new committee member orientation process, both at the city level and at the existing committee member level. And so I'm flagging that because now it's a second kind of resignation we've seen on a similar type of theme where people are leaving and they have concerns about the advisory committee process or the advisory committee in general, what goes on. So I do have a quick question for staff about that. So I wanted to ask, because from my understanding, I want to understand like where these kinds of processes go and where they may go in terms of unpacking them, understanding them, looking at them, reviewing them. So to City Auditor Brown, is it possible, I'm not asking for this to happen today or via motion, this is just a general question, is it possible for there to be an audit of advisory committees more broadly?
City Auditor?
Through the chair, yes, it's possible. We could look at any process in the city. As you know, we're meeting with each councillor to develop our work plan for the term of council. So my suggestion would be to, when we meet, put that on the list, and we'll consult with all the councillors on whether they feel that's an appropriate one for us to include.
Thanks so much, City Auditor Brown. Appreciate it.
Any other comments?
City Manager Smith-Mutson.
Thank you. Through the chair. So in my time here, there's been a few over time concerns raised about advisory committees in a number of different areas. There's been issues come forward to council about the budgets allocated to each advisory committee and how the monies can be used, because we don't really have a policy around that. In terms of staff support to the advisory committees, it's not consistent across the board. So there's clerk staff there because it is a committee of council and the procedure bylaw, et cetera. But there's also staff support from the different program areas because there's connections to seniors work with the Seniors Advisory Committee as an example. But I would say it's consistent. It's inconsistent. It's in some areas, there's a struggle to, I think, adequately support them from staff resources because they've got too much on their work plate to do it. So I think in terms of the complaints coming forward, and everyone's taken seriously, that it may be something for council to consider as just a review of how the advisory committee functions, how they're supported, et cetera, and whether that's the auditor who does it or we do it as staff. Either way, but I think it's warranted.
Thank you, City Manager. Councillor?
Thanks, I appreciate that comment. Actually, as a former chair of an advisory committee, I can say that I'm deeply concerned about the inconsistencies, the inequities in advisory committees. Experienced this firsthand in a very visceral way, frankly. And so I really think that a review, whether it's through an audit or some other mechanism at some point in the future, needs to happen so that we can ensure that we're supporting people.
So is that going to be like a notice of motion?
No, I'm not going to do that today. I think as Auditor Brown has said, the audit team is going around and having meetings with counselors, and that's maybe perhaps a discussion to have in that context. And if it's not found to be, the audit isn't found to be the place for it, it can find a new home, perhaps another kind of review. And so I think it's just best to wait, I think, till we have the conversations about the audit and see if it's the home for it first. And if not, then following up. And I'm happy to bring that forward at a future meeting.
Okay. And then, do you want to take the chair back then? Okay.
Thank you, Councillor Huang. Next up is Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask through you if there is any type of exit interview for members of advisory committees who resign?
Not sure who would like to answer that. I know that Director Stahl here, who I know does some of these things, and City Manager Smith might be responding.
Through the chair, there is no formal process. Unlike with staff, we give them an opportunity to do an exit interview. Certainly, though, through the advisory committees that are supported through the city manager's office, I would hear from the staff liaison about any of the concerns that may be linked to the resignation. But again, because they're supported from across different parts of the organization, I'm not sure always the themes get pulled up and captured, because there's multiple accountabilities for the advisory committees.
Councillor Clark?
Thank you, Chair, and I thank the city manager for that. So if there are multiple accountabilities for the advisory committees, who on our staff would be responsible for training all of the advisory committees to the same level of training?
City Manager Smith?
Through the chair, in terms of clerks would have a centralized role because they are committees of council. So certainly clerks would have a role in that and would be the one consistent body. From the staff supports there in the various program areas, but they could participate in the training.
I appreciate the conversation around whether or not the auditor should be the one that reviews our advisory committees. But I also think that our staff should be able to present to this committee and any committee of council exactly how they're conducting the training, what the training looks like, and what those standards are. Because I do recall issues coming up in the last council also, but they seem to be over here, over there. They're not, and so they don't get captured as there's a pattern. And so I'll look to the chair at the appropriate time, but I think we need to review the training process. We need to review the onboarding process for members to these advisory committees. And Madam City Manager, my concern would be that anybody that sits on an advisory committee gets the same training and same onboarding, so that we're all on the same page. And I'm not quite sure that's happening at the moment. I know they are doing training, which is excellent, but we can always improve what we're doing, and that's my point. I'm not trying to disparage anyone who organizes the training, but perhaps it's an opportunity for the city manager to review what the process is for all of those committees, because I understand from being the city council liaison on a number of advisory committees, I saw different training aspects. And so I think it's important that we at least look at that, Madam City Manager. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor Clark. And just capturing what you also said there was about the offboarding process also, right? So that there's a consistent offboarding process. Just anecdotally and briefly, as a former member of an advisory committee, when I became a city councillor, nothing happened. So, like, what does that look like for somebody who was and that's a very, I guess, unique situation, but just saying, and that's nothing happened. Okay, we're moving on to, if there's other speakers on the subject, and I don't see any, we're moving on to item 8, on our agenda. Oh, no, we're not. I lied. We're first going to vote on this item before we go to item 8. So we already have a mover and a seconder, so we're going to have the online vote now on the communication items. And that carries 6-0. And now we're on to item 8, for real. That's the staff presentation section. And we're going to be having a presentation from the City Auditor, Charles Brown. And this is on item 8.1. It's the Fraud and Waste Annual Report. And that's report number AUD 23003. For those that are at home and interested, AUD stands for Audit and 23 stands for 2023. We'll continue to try and decode these numbers as we see them. And on that point, I think the auditor's presentation here that's on the screen for us to review. And please take it away, City Auditor Brown.
Chair Kretsch, through you, I present our annual fraud and waste report. The purpose of this report is to provide an overview of all whistleblower fraud and waste matters that came to our attention during the period July 2021 to June 2022. The Fraud and Waste Hotline is an independently run confidential service where the general public or employees of the city can report suspicions of wrongdoing or make complaints about waste. The hotline is available 24/7 and is accessible online or through a dedicated phone number or by email. Reporters, which is a term that we use for complainants, can report concerns to an independent third-party operator of the hotline and can choose to identify themselves, or they can choose to remain anonymous. The City Auditor's Office receives these reports through the case management system that is supplied with this service. The hotline is meant to encourage the public and employees to report concerns and, in the longer term, to help the city address these concerns and improve building trust and confidence in city government. For this most recent reporting period, there were a total of 107 reports that were received, which is a number that significantly exceeds the previous years, which were 80 and 85. The increase continued on into the remainder of 2022, with the calendar year receiving 134 complaints. So I think we can legitimately conclude that the hotline continues to be well used. Overall, with the reports that have been closed this year, the substantiation rate of allegations made is 32%. Just for comparison, Ottawa's substantiation rate on their latest report was 26% and Toronto's was 17%. This slide shows a breakdown of the different types of issues that make up the complaints that we have received. The highest volume, besides multiple types, are in social services fraud, time theft or misconduct, and conflicts of interest. You will note on here that there is a category labeled out of jurisdiction. This refers to situations that are reported to us, but they are not within the domain of our function or authority. For example, we could get a matter that is criminal that has nothing to do with the city. That occasionally happens, in which case we pass along information to the police. This shows the breakdown of reports made by employees, which was 64%, versus reports that come in from citizens, which is 36%. Of the 107 reports, 42 were made directly to our office. The rest were made actually through the hotline. And we call these types of situations proxy reports. Actually, we enter them ourselves into the system. And the reason we still enter them is that the case management system is provided along with the service, which is very valuable to us. It allows us to administer the caseload, to track status, maintain files, facilitate the evidence gathering, record communications and milestones and key dates, and essentially gather the statistics that we're looking at today. So it's a great tool that we have in addition to the 24/7 service. Here we present the various actions taken on the complaints that came in. 55 were referred to the appropriate business area, and that includes areas such as human resources, asking for their review and written response. And in those situations, when we get the response, we then evaluate that response for consideration of any further action on our part. 19 were referred with no further action taken. 2 are still pending further information. 9 cases where there was no further action at all. In other words, we didn't refer it, but we just took no action at the outset. And 22 cases where we conducted an investigation. This slide shows the disposition of cases for the 107 that arose in the reporting period, plus the 13 cases that were actually carried over from the previous year, so 120 in total. 33 were substantiated out of 104 cases that were actually resolved, for a substantiation rate of 32%. This shows the different outcomes that were related to our investigations and report back referrals. There were 2 terminations, 4 other types of action. The total value of loss or waste was estimated for the reporting period regarding these incidents at $718,000, with recoveries of $7.3 thousand. Now, since that brings the accumulated amount of loss or waste since the inception of the hotline at $1,157,000. So the report contains some brief summaries you will see of the investigations that we undertook, and I'll just briefly describe some of the investigations and their outcomes. There was one case that involved a member of city management allegedly having significant social relationships with 2 vendors, vendors that ended up being favored when it came to being selected for work, and how their work and performance was overseen. Our investigation substantiated these complaints and led us to reiterate and augment, you will see in the front of our report, augment our recommendations for improving the processes for disclosure of conflicts of interest and the related policies for gifts and hospitality. We also had a couple of complaints where we investigated and found that the city was owed money. One where costs were supposed to have been borne by a lessee but weren't, and then another that involved damage to city property of $5,300. We had the Waterdown Gardens investigation that concerned allegations of corruption involving 2 city employees and alleged diversion of contaminated soil from city projects to the Waterdown Gardens site. That investigation determined that the allegations against the employees were unsubstantiated, and the contaminated soil at that site was actually coming from locations outside the city of Hamilton. We looked into one complaint about an error in the accounting for costs related to a building permit issued in error. We substantiated that the costs, which were significant, had not been taken out of the appropriate reserve as they should have been, and this has since been corrected. There were 2 allegations related to the leasing of city-owned property. Both properties were leased at a nominal fee, so far below market value. And in one case, the lessee allowed a commercial business to operate on the property rent-free. And in the other, the lessee was itself subleasing the property and making a profit from that. These were both substantiated, and our office, with the benefit of what we learned in the course of investigation, decided to commence an audit of the city's leasing and licensing practices. And that audit is currently underway, and the results will be presented to this committee later this year. We had an investigation of stolen iPads that led us to initiate an audit of mobile asset security. That audit was delivered last year and had 8 recommendations for improvement. Another investigation involved a discrepancy in inventory where supplies of approximately $200,000 were missing from inventory, or at least not accounted for in the system. And that was substantiated, and improvements have been, and corrections have been made. We had an allegation that DART's vehicles were inadequately maintained and were unsafe. The poor state of repair was confirmed in a sample of vehicles that we did independently, and in a review of inspection and maintenance practices, which resulted in 73 recommendations. We received an allegation that was later substantiated about an Ontario Works fraud. There was another conflict of interest that was substantiated involving a manager that had close relatives working for 2 different contractors doing significant work for the city. The contractors whose work and performance was overseen by the manager, who was in a position to accept, reject, or penalize the deliverables. That was confirmed. Finally, with respect to our roads program, we received information about 2 critical issues that were having a detrimental effect on the quality of roadwork projects. We launched an audit and confirmed that there were significant weaknesses in the city's processes specifically for weight validation of placed construction materials and disposed excess, and also in processes for testing and validating asphalt aggregates to ensure road projects receive the actual quality that was specified. Those are the main cases that we have in our report, and some closing reflections which are provided in commentary at the front of our report. We've noted for the 2nd year now the recurring issue of staff that have undisclosed conflicts of interest, conflicts that are not reported, or if they are, not properly addressed. We recommended improvement to the conflict of interest policy, and our understanding is that Human Resources Division is currently working on those improvements. Another type of issue that bears looking at too that's related to the conflicts of interest is having a clear understanding or guidance about the appropriateness of high levels of socializing with contractors or vendors to the city. Specifically, we made 2 recommendations to consider defining and prohibiting non-pecuniary interest, and secondly, to be explicit in defining what is and what is not acceptable in terms of engaging in social activities with vendors. To summarize, our hotline continues to be well used. It has benefits beyond just finding the wrongdoing and putting a stop to it. As many of you know, the hotline was a pilot project for 3 years. This is our last year that we're reporting on. We're currently finalizing our evaluation report on the outcomes of introducing the hotline to assist in making a decision about its continuation. And to that end, you will see in our committee report, I'm asking for a 2-month extension to our service contract to keep it going while we present our report to this committee for decision on the way forward. The budget impact is minimal. In fact, even with this extension of 2 months, we will still remain within the original budget. Lastly, I just want to thank all the citizens and employees of Hamilton who took the time to use the hotline and report their concerns, and to also express our appreciation to staff and management who have cooperated with us in our audits and investigations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, City Auditor Brown. Just going to delineate what's going to happen next, just for folks who are following along here in the meeting or otherwise. So this is the presentation section. And we're going to ask questions of the presenter about the presentation itself. And then from there, we will receive the presentation, and then we will put the report on the floor, which contains 2 recommendations, and we'll discuss the report. And I'm pretty sure that the first speaker on our list for the presentation is Councillor Clark. Go ahead, Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair Cretch. I appreciate this. And thank the Auditor General for the report. It was a very comprehensive report. In one section of the report, and I'm just going to try and find it while I'm speaking, you indicated, it's Appendix A, page 26 to 29, that the auditor believes the circumstances demonstrate the critical importance of having a strong mitigation plans in place to protect both the city employees when the report of conflict of interest allegations are received. So 2 questions there. How are we currently doing it? In essence, they're whistleblowers. How are we receiving the complaint, and how do we ensure the anonymity of that whistleblower?
City Auditor Brown.
So appreciate your question through the chair. So I'll take the second one first, ensuring the anonymity. That's actually an obligation I have under the Municipal Act. So if you use the hotline or come to us directly, we can certainly maintain that. If you are using the hotline and you are still nevertheless concerned about revealing your identity, you can use the software itself. You're just you get a PIN number to log in, and you remain anonymous, but we can still converse. We can still, it's almost like texting back and forth and asking questions. So there are quite a few safeguards that way to assure anonymity for reporters. In terms of the first question, the critical importance of strong mitigation plans, having them in place, it's not, what we're trying to suggest is, it's not just important for the city to have strong mitigation, but it's also to prevent false allegations or false misinterpretation, which causes great distress for the employees involved if an allegation is made. It's better to have the strong mitigation, is what we're saying, to protect equally the employee from false allegations.
Thank you for that. Chair Cretch, can I ask the Auditor General, has he received a whistleblower commentary through the telephone line and they don't want to provide their name?
Through the chair, yes, that has happened. Yes.
And so how do you just accept the complaint, or do you encourage them to follow the process of the whistleblower? So
we determine at the outset whether it's, so that technically if it's an employee, number one, and
Yes.
the person can identify themselves as an employee, but still remain anonymous. So if we're in that situation, the next question is, well, does this qualify as a whistleblower? And the answer to that is no, it doesn't, because our policy requires identification to us. It doesn't require identification to the broader community of people. But to us, in order to qualify as a whistleblower and be protected as an employee, we have to know who you are. So I can still protect your identity, but that's what makes, now that's not to say we wouldn't still investigate. It's just where the whistleblower policy comes into effect and the protections that come into effect. But it doesn't mean that we can't investigate the matter. So there are some matters we investigate that aren't covered by the whistleblower policy.
Thank you, I appreciate that. My last question, if I may, and it was, I believe in your presentation, gifts and hospitality on page 16 of your slide. So to use the chair's expression, I'm trying to unpack this. So my concern is that lunches, dinners, golf trips, golf tickets to come and play golf, all of these things are being interpreted by some in our staff as social obligations. So these are stakeholders that we're working with, and so it's appropriate for me to go out to dinner with them to try and whatever. And I'm trying to understand how we can tighten that to ensure that there is no unintentional creation of a conflict of interest. I kind of think those are conflicts of interest from my perspective, but I'd like to hear your commentary in terms of how we improve this entertainment or gift and hospitality category that we are discussing.
So through the chair, so that conflict that you're experiencing in terms of interpretation is the very reason we suggest the policy provide more details, because some people will not see the conflict. And some of the things that contribute to whether or not it's a conflict is, was it ever disclosed? Is the level of socializing, is management or your supervisors aware of the level of socializing that goes on? Is a contributing factor, and other various circumstances. So that's the very reason we said there should be well, for one, a definition of non-pecuniary. There's currently a definition we use of having a pecuniary interest.
Yes.
But we found examples of we found other jurisdictions, other organizations that actually went so far as to bar non-pecuniary interests, which will require, obviously, a definition of the circumstances that covers. But we think that would be a prudent measure to take.
Thank you, Chair Kretsch. I sincerely appreciate the efforts of the Auditor General. He always comes through with a report that tells us what's going on, but he also, in acknowledging issues that he's learning about, he's coming forward and saying, make this recommendation to change the policy, which would help us mitigate or prevent those things from happening again. And I think that's great. And I am very pleased with the hotline itself. I think it has exceeded the expectations of some of my colleagues around that table. And we're clearly seeing that our staff are watching other employees, and where they think there's an issue, they do notify the Auditor General, at least have that conversation and then go from there, which we want to encourage that level of trust, to at least reach out to the AG and say, here's what I'm seeing, is there an issue here? And then have that discussion, especially if their managers are not willing to look into that matter. So sincerely, I think you guys are doing fantastic work, and I support the extension at the appropriate time. Thank you, Chair. And with regards to the gifts and social, we'll take that up at governance and invite you in to dive in a little bit deeper with us, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Sorry for the extended time. I appreciate the latitude.
You had a full minute left. I don't see any other speakers on the list, and so I'm just going to briefly ask one question, and then we can turn to the vote. My question is about prevention. So you didn't outright say this, but I read your slide that said $718,000 was lost, generalizing, and $7.3 thousand or $7,300 was recuperated or brought back, or we got it back. Cool, that's 1%. So it looks like once we identify a loss and then audit and investigate what happened, and then at some point attempt to recover the loss, is not as effective as trying to prevent the loss in the first place, because of course a 1% return on attempting to recover those losses is extremely low. And preventing the loss in the first place would obviously be the better. I just want your thoughts on that. Like I'm making some assumptions in saying that, and that's how I interpreted the slides, but I wonder what your thoughts are.
So through you, Chair, yeah, I agree. This particular year, it's a low number, and in years past, it has been a higher number of recoveries. It just varies according to the circumstances. The number one thing about investigating fraud is stop the bleeding. That's number one. But the second very valuable thing about it is learn the lessons. If you don't learn the lessons about how to prevent it, and I think that's the point you're making, then the losses will continue. The exposure, the risk of such loss will continue, and that needs to be addressed for the investigations that we do to have their full effect and impact.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And there's a speaker on the list now, Councillor Beattie.
Thank you, Chair Crenchen. Just a question in terms of process through you. By accepting this report, are we voting on the extension of the program, the 2-month extension? Is that embedded in the acceptance of the report?
Yes, and we accept the report. We'll be accepting the recommendations in the report, the first A and B that are there. Yep, when we get to that.
Just wanted to be absolutely sure, then I would speak in favor of doing that. As a member of a former audit committee in another jurisdiction at HWDSB for 4 years and now on this committee, I love seeing these reports, City Auditor Brown. The audit function is kind of like archaeology.
Before we get there, I don't want to steal your thunder, I'm sorry. But before we get there,
go ahead,
could we receive the presentation from the auditor unless you had a question for it, and then do it?
Then I will send you glowing reviews after that.
Okay, if we have a mover and seconder to receive the report from the auditor, if there's no more speakers, then we can get to the report itself, and then you can.
To receive the presentation.
Presentation, yep. So moved by Councillor Huang to receive the presentation, seconded by Councillor Beattie to receive the presentation, and we'll have an electronic vote. That carries 6-0. And so at this point, we need to put the report itself on the floor. So I have a mover and seconder to put the report on the floor. Moved by Councillor Beattie, seconded by Councillor Huang. Are there any questions? We'll do it this way. Are there any questions for staff, like questions about the report? And then we'll go to any comments that people want to make about the report. So I see questions for staff, first from Councillor Clark. Okay.
Thank you. I guess this would be to the city manager. Requesting advice on how we proceed with a review of the policy on gifts and social gifts and that entire milieu that could translate into dozens of things. How do we review that in terms of ensuring that we are not mitigating but abating conflicts of interest? So if I don't go out to dinner with this developer, then I don't have an unqualifying conflict of interest because I met with him in my office on duty. That's my job. But if I start entertaining that individual, it changes my relationship with that individual. If
I
that
know you're
makes
using the
sense.
word "I" in your sentences, but I think you're referring to staff here because we have our own, right? So staff. City Manager Smith, please.
Through the chair. Thank you for the question. So just a couple comments, and I'll also get Laura Fontana to chime in as well, our Executive Director of Human Resources. So one of the great things that we have with having our Auditor General and Auditor here is that he provides to the senior leadership team themes that he's seeing. In a big organization, we'll find things in certain pockets, but it's that horizontal look. And so one of the themes he identified was conflict of interest, and including the gifts, those two things together. And in having conversations, it started to become clear that it was hard for some staff to wrap their head around what the potential could look like and how do you mitigate that? So we brought a report to Governance Subcommittee last term to say that we are going to, we were improving the conflict of interest, just how the policy reads and the process to, and who do you call to have a conversation with to help me figure this out. And so we're putting that in place, and I'll let Laura Fontana be a bit more specific about what we're doing. In terms of looking at the conflict of interest and strengthening it, I think there's an opportunity. We are having to come back to Governance Subcommittee with a direction around the issue about having employees who work for the city but may also have family businesses. And does that mean that family business can do business with the city in that area, in a different area? Because we're a very large organization and a lot of different businesses in the city. So we are looking at that. I'm thinking we could simply add that piece on to come back to Governance Subcommittee. With that, I'll pass it over to Laura Fontana.
So thank you through you, Mr. Chair, Laura Fontana, Executive Director of Human Resources. So as the city managers indicated, we are doing a comprehensive review of our code of conduct and the associated schedule. So for example, the conflict of interest, the conduct disclosure form, fees, gifts, and hospitalities, and the business integrity schedule, anti-nepotism, et cetera. So those amendments have been made, and we've made a lot of administrative changes to the code of conduct and the associated schedules. But what we need is also a comprehensive education and training, because part of the problem is people don't understand. Our employees are having difficulty understanding when they're presented with a conflict, potentially. And so we are going to be incorporating case studies, examples. So when you're finding yourself potentially in this a situation where you may be in a conflict of interest situation, that employees can have a greater understanding of what that means, and that they have a greater appreciation to potentially avoid those kinds of circumstances. We're also incorporating tools to acknowledge and record and track and report on the acknowledgements of the code of conduct and the schedule, so that we have that record, that employees have had a review, have an understanding, have had the training, and acknowledge their understanding of the code and the respective schedules. And then to the latter point, there we had a motion back last year on Schedule D, which is outside employment activities, and we are finalizing this work, and we're addressing again those potential conflicts. We have something to report to senior leadership team on February 28th, and our intention is to bring that to the governance subcommittee meeting on March 27th. So. And then, of course, the reference to the significant social relationships. We're doing targeted workshops across the organization, depending on the circumstances. Auditor Brown has raised some examples, and in those cases, we have worked with his office to delve into some of the issues, and then we are doing specific workshops in these targeted areas so that people understand that potential conflict, again, through case studies and examples, so that individuals understand what it means if they're potentially in a conflict of interest or those significant social relationships, that they can avoid that in the future. So we are doing a significant amount of work in this regard. Thank you.
So just to think that answers your question about where the process goes in terms of it'll be tacked
Yes.
on to governance review?
I have two ancillary questions,
Great.
if I may. Will the training for staff be a requirement? And by what I mean by that, Chair, is, for example, if it was digital training, there would be a record that they took the training. So there's a record that the training occurred. We know that we have explained to them what the policy looks like, and we've given them different case studies. Will we have a record so that all employees can be treated exactly the same?
So through the chair, yes, it is a requirement to sign off on the code of conduct. So it is done through our LMS system. They confirm that they have read and understood the code of conduct and the related schedules. It's done on a annual basis, and then we have a record of that confirmation from each employee.
Will the policy, to the best of our ability, depending on legislation, be congruent with what the policy is for city councillors in terms of their code of conduct? In other words, are the councillors being treated to the best of our abilities the exact same in terms of our staff?
Through the chair, to be fair, I'd have to go back and look at our code of conduct, which I'm more familiar with on a regular basis, and look at the council one to be able to answer that fully, Councillor.
I would appreciate that. And I guess the last question is, I know this is under Executive Director Fontana's authority, that she's doing this work. Will there be an information report brought back to council explaining how you have tackled this issue?
So through the chair, if I'm understanding Councillor Clark's question correctly, we are bringing back the two reports to council. Again, the Schedule D on the outside employment activities is going to the governance subcommittee. The amendments to the code of conduct and the related schedules is going to be coming to an upcoming council meeting, likely the AFNA committee first, and then for ratification at council. But that is happening after the senior leadership team reviews it on March 9th, and subject to their approval, then we'll put it on a following agenda.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate that, because I'm always concerned when we don't want to veer too much into the operational side that's under management control, but we need to have an understanding of what's going on so that we can provide our advice. So thank you, Chair. Those are all my questions.
I don't see anybody else for questions. I believe Councillor Beatty's first up for comments on the motion itself or the debate bit, thanks to staff. So go ahead, Councillor Beatty.
Thank you, Chair Kretchen. I'm sorry that my enthusiasm got me out of order. My thanks.
I did not call you out of order.
No,
I slightly nudged you.
Out of logistical order is what I meant. Very excellent questions from my colleague, Councillor Clark, and very thankful for his thoughtful approach to this. What I was going to say, and of course it's completely in favor of moving forward with extending this program. The audit function is a lot like archaeology. You start digging in, you never know what interesting things you'll find. But I think that it's critical and integral to build and restore trust and integrity in city government. And it's really a pillar, I think, of what we want to try to accomplish as a new council. So very, very supportive of the 2-month extension, and I think that will eventually lead to a permanent program, and I'm very excited to be a part of that. So enthusiastic to support this.
Thanks for your enthusiasm, Councillor Beattie. And we're now going to move to the vote on this report. It's electronic vote. It'll be on the recommendations in the report, and those are A and B. Before you will vote. And that carries 6-0. Now we're on to item 8.2. And I believe there is someone here from the Committee Against Racism, the Timer Kasim or Marlene de Amoa, to come to turn their microphones and their cameras on to begin their verbal presentation. This is the Committee Against Racism's annual report. And I'll look to Elsie Bates to see if those folks are here.
Timer is on the WebEx. He can turn his microphone and camera on.
Just for those watching at home, this is the item 8.2. It's the Committee Against Racism's annual report, and this is an annual report of the advisory committee. And the co-chairs of the committee will present their annual report, and then there's a chance for us to ask any questions of the presenters, and then we will receive the presentation before we go on to consent items 9 on our agenda.
Timer, are you on the call? Can you hear me? We are ready for your annual report. Perhaps, Mr. Chair, we can move on to the next items and come back to him after consent.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we'll move on now to item 9, which are consent items. And we'll come back in case either of the co-chairs of the Committee Against Racism appears. There wasn't a presentation copy in advance. There's nothing for us to review until they're there. So that's why we're doing it in this way. Nothing to approve until they come forward. 9.1 is the update. And so we're going to, just so folks know, we're going to receive the consent items together in 2 votes. So 9.1 and 9.2 we're going to do together. 9.1 is an update on the procurement of liquid chlorine in railway tank cars for the Woodward water and wastewater treatment plants, and that's related to reports FCS 22050A and PW 22047A. And 9.2 is the 2020 and 2021 audited financial statements for City of Hamilton business improvement areas, FCS 23016. So can I have a mover and a seconder to put consent items 9.1 and 9.2 on the floor? I see Councillor Tattison and I see a seconding from Councillor Huang. Are there any questions on these 2 consent items? Just going to quickly check the other universe. Nope, no one's there. Not seeing speakers. We'll require an electronic vote to receive consent items 9.1 and 9.2. So please look to your e-scribe. It shall be appearing shortly.
And apologies, Mr. Chair, I did miss the mover and the seconder for this item.
No problem. Mover is Councillor Tattison and seconded by Councillor Huang.
Councillor Huang?
Yep.
Thank you.
The vote is up. Please click accordingly. And that carries 6-0. And so now we're going to move from 9.2 to 9.3 and 9.4. Again, we're going to do these together. 9.3 is the Hamilton Women and Gender Equity Committee minutes from December 23rd of 2022. 9.4 are the Committee Against Racism minutes from January 10th of 2023. Can I have a mover and seconder to put the consent items 9.3 and 9.4 on the floor? Seeing Councillor Huang is moving, seconded by Councillor Tattison. Are there any questions about either of these 2 sets of minutes in these advisory committees? I don't see any speakers, so we will go to the electronic vote. And that is carried 6-0. And so we will now just pause briefly here in the space in between things to see if we're going to have Timer or Marlene are available for the Committee Against Racism report.
Oh, Timer, I hear him.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was in a work meeting, so I couldn't unmute myself when you asked.
That is okay. 8.2, the Committee Against Racism's annual report is before us. If you'll turn your camera on, Timer, and you're welcome to begin to deliver the report. Just so everyone knows, this is not a delegation, this is a presentation, so people are able to speak for longer than 5 minutes, although we are restricting our questions to 5 minutes still. So thank you so much for being here today and look forward to your report.
Sure. So I'm going to try to turn my video on, if you give me 1 sec. Okay. Hi, everyone. Sorry for the shaggy look. This is the nature of work from home these days.
Completely fine.
It's nice to meet everyone. My name is Tamer. I'm the chair, the current chair of the Committee Against Racism that advises the City Council and any other initiatives. So in terms of report, I'll be brief. Last year and leading up into this year, and we're thinking January, February, we spent a lot of time finalizing our work plan for the committee. Because of HARC, we had set aside quite a few items to focus on the Hamilton Anti-Racism Resource Center. So just going back through our previous minutes and action items and figuring out, what were we responsible for doing, what should we be doing, what did we want to do, and we identified many themes that were important to us and will be important to the committee that the new committee that comes in. So as a brief overview, looking at our mandate, discussing with our staff liaison, our primary goal is to continue to support the city and city council, and find ways to do that. And then outside of that, we're going to be looking to almost reinvigorate our connections with the community as a whole. I remember when I first joined CARB, this was many years ago, we would regularly have individuals from the community come in and present to us and talk about some of the issues they're facing. So we're hoping to really restart and reinvigorate that connection. Let people know that we exist and how we can help and support them in their work. Once we kind of settled on that, we tried to action some of those work plan items to the best of our ability. The election this summer kind of hampered our ability to do that, but that's not a big deal. We're back at it, and we're trying to get caught up where we can. The main outcome or the main output of our work from last year is our involvement in the change to the selection process of the community member for the Hamilton Police Services Board. So we very closely supported and followed that process through. We started with the CCR, then delegations, and most recently we were involved in the interview process and selection of the community members for that selection committee. So that's pretty much it. We've been busy. We've been busy. We've tried to be organized, and here we are. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you for the time.
Thanks so much for your presentation, and thanks as a volunteer for all the work you're doing on this committee, and all the folks who do work on our volunteer committees, and for taking the time today to come when you're working to give us a brief presentation on what you've been doing over the year, which sounds like a lot. I'm not seeing questions from anybody here in the committee at the moment, so just thank you so much for your presentation, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
On that note, we would need a couple of people to, a mover and a seconder even, to move and second that they would receive this presentation, and then we can have an electronic vote. And I see it moved by Councillor Tattison and seconded by Councillor Alex Wilson. And so we will have an electronic vote in receiving the presentation. And that item is carried. And now we're moving on to discussion items. So just for folks following along, we're at item number 10 right now, and after we item 11, which are motions. And item 10.1 is the Hamilton Women and Gender Equity Committee Citizen Committee report respecting applying a gender lens to the City of Hamilton for the operational budget. Just so folks know, this contains a recommendation on the operating budget, so it'll need to be referred to consideration of the budget. And so it's, as we all know, it's a little bit late in the budget process for 2023. So we could, if we accept the recommendations here, we can report back to the General Issues Committee for their development of the 2024 budget, which is just letting people know, flagging that right up front. But before we get to that, can I have somebody move and second putting the Citizen Committee report on the floor for discussion? Councillor Huang, and a seconder, Councillor Beattie. And are there any questions on the Citizen Committee report? And just so everyone knows, Pascal Marchand, a committee member, is here and can answer questions if we have any about the report. I'm not sure how else it works, but I think that it's a questioning bit now. And so if anyone wants to ask Pascal a question, or even just to provide Pascal the opportunity to speak, go for it. Councillor Clark.
I guess I'm trying to understand how we draft a gender lens to the operational budget. What would that look like, in their words, from the committee? Because I'd like to ask staff shortly to make sure that we're all on the same page.
Sure, so what we'll do first, and thanks for flagging that, is we'll ask questions of folks in the committee who are here, and then we'll turn to questions from staff afterwards. And if you want to introduce this in some meaningful way to provide context, Pascal, please do. And respond to the councillor's question if you don't mind.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. First, I would like to point out that the Citizens Committee report that has been provided to Council is not.
This is the correct report through the chair. The wording was revised with the input of the committee and is revised to be appropriate recommendations for the committee.
Sorry, I just want to interject here briefly to understand what on earth is going on. So I think you're trying to suggest say something, Pascal, about the report. Please go ahead.
The version that is presented to Council, from our understanding as the Women and Gender Equity Advisory Committee, was our first draft, to which the Office of the City Clerk told us to send them a revised draft because the use of the hyperlinks was inappropriate. So a new version was sent on February 6th and resent on February 15th because it was our understanding that the hyperlinks were inappropriate. So through the chair to the clerks, that's the first draft that's available right now. That's my first concern.
So the hyperlinks were left in because, and the through the chair, the hyperlinks were left in the report for members to see. The danger of including hyperlinks in a report is that they could break, and for posterity. And so we asked the staff liaison or the staff support for the Hamilton Women and Gender Equity Committee to capture that information that was included in the links so that we have all that information on record in the file for the meeting. So the version with the links was maintained. I believe that was reported back to the committee.
Okay, so for those following along, we're dealing with the procedural issue here first before we get to questions and comments. Just want to now flag that's where we are. And so perhaps I can ask the question that maybe would help us get to the next part, which would be what changes were made to the report?
Are you asking us?
I don't know what I'm asking, to be completely honest, but I can ask you, Pascal, are there significant changes made to the report, and would you want it to be sent back to the Women and Gender Committee so you can review it? Like, it's your report.
Okay, so the changes that we resent on February 6th, we revised it so that we were following the American Psychological Association reference style, and we used a bibliography or a reference at the end instead of using hyperlinks throughout the document. The original ask was that we copy the web pages as appendixes, so we provided a bibliography instead. So if that was inappropriate, what was reported back to us yesterday was that the report would look different, but we were not advised exactly how.
No, what was advised was that the report would be, the links would be removed for report to council, but the active links, the URLs would remain in there, and that's all that will be changed. So that we won't be, and if those links break, clerks will not be correcting the links to maintain those links in that report. That is what was reported back to you yesterday.
Okay, so it looks like what happened is there were some links. Those links caused some type of a technical issue. So the links were changed. So just summarizing, I'm not trying to be exact here, I'm just summarizing. There were some links, there was an issue with the hyperlinks, and so that seems to have been corrected. Pascal, have you been able to review the report? The question here I'm asking you simply is, do you want to proceed with the report that's in front of us today, or do you want to go back to the committee? That is your prerogative. I just want to know so we can decide if we're proceeding or not.
Okay, so the content besides the hyperlinks remains the same.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for that, and thanks for the clarity. I appreciate you. I get it's confusing. There's a lot of tight turnaround times with this kind of thing, and what agenda things appear on and what they don't appear on and when they appear, and communicating with the committee can be very challenging. I understand that, especially for volunteers, so thanks for highlighting that difficulty and letting us know. Did you want to introduce this briefly, or did you want to just respond to Councillor Clark's question directly?
So I can answer Councillor Clark's
Okay,
question,
great. Thanks so much. Go ahead.
Which, if I recall, was how to use a gender lens to the budgeting process. Was that correct?
Yes, that's it. That is correct.
Okay. So the way that a city council can use a gender budget lens to a council is just keeping in mind that women, gender diverse folks, trans folks go through society in a different way than those who are cisgendered, and that things like access to childcare, access or being victims of violence and harassment are more likely to happen to these people, to us. And so it's just keeping that in mind, in the back of your mind as you go through the budget process.
So if I understand correctly, Chair, and I really am sorry to belabor this, but the intention is that budget policy would include a gender lens on items that would fall under that gender lens.
Pascal?
Technically, everything does come down to gender in some way or another. So using a gender lens to the budget, it just means that whenever you're reviewing something within the budget, to think about how could this affect women, trans, and gender non-binary folks. Because everything does somehow touch, like the roads, for example. It may affect the women in a different way than it may affect a man, because stereotypically women will be pushing the strollers. So if they're pushing a stroller across the road and the road is in poor condition, it can be dangerous to them. But it also, so it can be something as basic as that, but then it can also be as big as early learning, childcare development programs.
Okay, and at the appropriate time, I would have a question of staff, please. Thank you very much, though.
Are there other questions for the chair? I see Councillor Alex Wilson next. Is there anybody else just indicating WebEx? I'll catch you there. Councillor Alex Wilson, go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Pascal, for the report and the presentation today. I think it's an ask that to me lines up with the with the calls to action and the recommendations in the Just Recovery Hamilton report. And feel free to say this is out of scope or not related, but because it's an overlapping ask with the Just Recovery Hamilton report, I'm wondering if you'd be able to speak to kind of following up on Councillor Clark's question about what does this actually look like. My recollection of that report is there's several asks that would kind of feed into this or act as a starting point for a gender-based lens in budgeting. Are there any kind of some of those recommendations or some other examples you want to pick up on just to help us as a committee understand what this could look like, or what does that actually kind of involve? Asking ourselves the question in budgeting process: how does this impact women? How does this impact Two-Spirit people? How does this impact trans and non-binary people in our city? Is definitely the question to be asking. Maybe walking us through some of those examples of how, in answering that question, we might get unique or novel policy.
Pascal?
Through the chair. Thank you, Councillor Wilson. That was a really good question. That's a really tough question to answer. If I understand, the Citizen Committee report was made not in conjunction with the Just Transition Coalition. It's a separate report. The reason that this report came across or came forward is because we had a presentation from the folks at the YWCA who explained to us the impacts of municipal budgets on the women, gender non-binary, trans folks in the city. And we felt that their comments were very valid. So in some way it is related to the Just Transition because the YWCA was also part of this committee for the Just Transition Coalition. And that's how this came about. But as women, trans, and gender non-binary folks, we felt that it was important to take into consideration how certain things affect us differently.
Councillor Alex Wilson, did you have any other questions, or was that it? Or
No, thank you. I really do appreciate that. Similar to Councillor Clark, I have some comments for after, but thank you so much, Pascal, for the work of the committee and for this report today.
thanks so much. I'm not seeing any other speakers or questions for Pascal. I have one, and so
Please go ahead.
Councillor Wang, you also have a question? Go ahead.
No, I thought you wanted to.
Oh, yes, so please, you're the chair now. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm somehow forgetting that important point. This isn't my first time seeing such a request come up for a budget. It's, in fact, part of other municipal structures across North America. We see gender-based budgeting is something that people are talking about a lot more. And so I just wondered if you could speak to, I guess, how you see this informing our priorities and how you see budgets as a priority. Like, if you could speak to that point, which I think is the overarching point you're making here, which is budgets are about priorities, and using the kind of perspective you're asking us to take when we're budgeting will help us inform how we prioritize these things and who it impacts.
Pascal?
Thank you. I'm just trying to think of how to answer that as best as possible. Could you repeat the question again?
Councillor?
It's more of just wanting an affirmation from you to understand, am I understanding this correctly, right? You're coming forward asking for us to approach the budget from a perspective that acknowledges the positionality and impacts for women, gender, non-conforming and non-binary folks. And you're saying that that approach to the budget is about really outlining the priorities. And how we prioritize things that happen in our city, because budgets are literally just a priority document. So just giving you the runway to speak to that, I think, in a broader sense of like what the broader ask here is and how we can connect that to the budget process.
Okay, so applying a lens to a budget can be done in many different ways. I know that there is a push to have health in all policies through public health. So how do city or municipal budgets affect the health of people because how the city puts together its budget will have direct impacts on how people live their lives in this city. It's called the social development or the social determinants of health, and these are directly related to how our cities function. It's the built environment, it's the social programs, it's everything that makes us a community. So from a gender lens, again, as I mentioned with children, early learning, childcare programs are very important to ensure that women can go to work and that they can make money for their families, which then in turn ensures that they have a roof over their heads and that they have food security. Access to affordable housing and sexual and reproductive health care also ensures that women, trans, and gender non-binary folks have a good life, which then in turn helps the community, helps the province, helps the country in ensuring that we're not shifting the bucket of money from onto fixing the problem downriver. So putting a gender lens to this allows us to help fix some of the issues upstream so that we're not shifting the burden downstream. Because, for example, if you can't hold a job because you need to take care of your children, then you have housing issues, then you have health issues. Everything is interrelated, everything is interconnected. That's the beauty of gender, it's the intersectionality of it all. I'm not sure if I explained it as clearly as you would like me to, but it's just that everything is related. And unfortunately, in the society that we still live in now, your gender matters and it will make a difference in how you can navigate this society.
Thank you, Pascal. Councillor? No more? Back to you then.
Not seeing other folks with questions for the delegate right now, so I'm just going to return to my roadmap here just a moment. Yeah, so at this point there are questions to staff, and so I know that Councillor Clark had a question to staff, and we'll go to that. And then also Councillor Huang also has a question for staff, so Councillor Huang is next on the list. Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Clark.
Thank you, Chair. So I'd like to hear from Mr. Zagaric as to what would change in our process if we adopt a gender lens as is recommended by this advisory committee.
Through the chair, Mike Zagaric, General Manager, Finance Corporate Services. It has been likely 5 years since the last time I looked at examined gender budgeting. In fact, it was through a presentation I made to this particular citizen committee on gender budgeting as they were considering the opportunities around gender budgeting. So it has been a number of years since I have reviewed gender budgeting with respect to municipal budgeting processes. But drawing from my memory, municipalities have embarked on gender budgeting in some municipalities, a limited number of municipalities, in a manageable way or approach. And those municipalities managed the scale of the effort by focusing on changes in the budget. And so by changes in the budget, it could be where there are staff recommendations surrounding amending service levels, amending services, either through a business case or a council referred. Those considerations were required to include content regarding how that service amendment may impact gender. And as an example, if a transit route was to change its duration or frequency, and that particular transit route serviced a particular form of development, then that form of development, for instance, commercial and industrial, had a certain reliance on a particular gender, it would identify that change, would identify whether it could be at the detriment or to the benefit of a gender. Particular gender. And so again, it's been a number of years since examining gender-based budgeting. I will just also reference that we are also working with our climate change office on carbon budgeting as well. So there are a series of lenses that may be considered through the budget process. Each lens will have an impact across the organization. This isn't simply a financial exercise. It requires input across the organization. Again, using the transit example, it would require transit staff to try to assess what the impact of a particular amendment or service might have. Again, drawing on past knowledge is municipalities and municipal councils have directed some of this reviewer effort to external bodies and to allow a commenting body to review the various amendments and provide recommendations to council as to whether or not a particular amendment may be at a benefit, not only to a particular gender, but to the community as a whole. It's not always net zero in terms of the benefits of a particular amendment or to the detriment of a particular gender or group or segment of population. So again, through the chair, apologize. It's been a number of years since the last time I investigated gender-based budgeting. It has been, I believe there are a few Ontario municipalities. I believe last time I reviewed this, City of Toronto and City of Ottawa, at that time it was based, they tried to scale it and manage it with respect to changes in budget. But again, if required, staff can review and report back on options. Again, I am relying on some historical experience or knowledge.
It's okay, you're not being asked to report on it now. So don't worry. Does that answer your question, Councillor Clark? And do you have more questions? Go ahead. If he doesn't, please rephrase and ask again, by all means.
I guess my question really is in terms of operationalizing this request. And I'm trying to understand, okay, here's the budget today. How would we change that process to operationalize that? And I'm not sure they're ready to answer that question today, but I think that's, for me, the issue. I have no opposition to what is being proposed, but I want to make sure that if we are adopting this lens, that it is operationalized properly in the budget. Does that make sense, Chair? Or am I?
Makes perfect sense to me. Now, maybe I'll just ask a brief question of staff about the procedural thing we're about to do, perhaps, and see if it will solve that problem.
Okay.
So that we make sure it's addressed.
Thank you, sir.
So what I'm seeing now is if there are no more speakers on this, what would happen would be we would, except for Councillor Huang, then we would go to an electronic vote to receive the Citizen Committee report and then refer it to the 2023 budget process for a report back to the GIC budget process in development of the 2024 budget. And so what that would allow you to do as staff, I presume, would be actually to comment on the feasibility of doing so, talk about that, and have council make a weigh-in on that subject. If not, then perhaps we have to change what we're about to do to make that happen. James Zagaric, if you could respond to that so I can make sure we understand.
Through the chair, just in listening to the potential direction, my recommendation would be not to refer this to the 2023 budget process. We simply have a few more committee dates left, and staff would not have enough runway to prepare a report back in the coming weeks. And so if there were to be direction to report back, for instance, for the 2024 budget process, it would be more appropriate to request a report back either to AFNA or to GIC.
I understand. Okay, so that I get it completely, and we could just do that. We could have that report come back to AFNA about that in advance of the 2024 budget process, rather than referring it to the process itself, is what you're suggesting. I understand what you're saying.
Just to confirm, so report back to AFNA and refer to 2024 budget process, or just report back to AFNA?
Yeah. Through the chair, a request to report back to AFNA, and then AFNA can decide whether or not to incorporate as part of the 24 budget process or 2025, depending on the scope, size, resources, and effort.
And when I get to that place, I'm going to ask another question just to follow up. But I think Councillor Huang wanted to first ask questions. But Elsie Bates, if you have another question for staff, please go ahead.
Certainly, just a clarification on what kind of time frame you might be looking at, GM Zagaric.
Through the chair, I would just ask today if just the request could be to report back to AFNA. I will have to work with staff in terms of this particular initiative. In addition, as I mentioned, we are reporting back on carbon budgeting, so we are developing that body of work as well. So again, I would just ask that staff be given the time to scope the capacity to report back in terms of the coming months.
So we maybe have it in advance of the process? So we want to ensure there's enough time so we don't
That
we're
was
reporting
my
back.
question, yeah.
So maybe I could put wording in the agenda. The motion could be something like, we're going to ask staff to report back on this thing in advance of the 2024 budget process to ensure there's enough time, in case council decides they want to implement it.
Through the chair, staff will commit to reporting back before the 2024 budget process, if at a minimum identifying what gender-based budgeting at the municipal level, municipal government may represent, and if required, through a subsequent report regarding resources or effort to deliver gender-based budgeting. But we will commit to providing a report back in advance of the 24 budget process.
Okay, so I think that gives enough information for Elsie Bates to be drafting something that will work while Councillor Huang asks a question of staff. And that satisfies, I'm seeing from Councillor Clark the question, so it looks like we're all carrying forward. Councillor Huang.
Thank you. And through you, Chair, I understand and appreciate where this is going. I think that from my recollection, there was always a mentorship program from management and Rising Star sort of staff that might be interested in the budgeting process. That happens concurrent at the same time, correct?
Through the chair, there are within departments such as Planning, Economic Development, and Public Works. As well, we, as corporate services, we reach out to young professionals and provide information to our young professionals group, to advisory committees. Again, it was a number of years ago that I was before this particular citizen committee, providing information at that time with respect to gender-based budgeting. So yes, internally as well as to advisory committees as requested.
Is there an opportunity through you, Chair, to just look at this from an informal perspective first? I know that technically and formally we will be receiving a report at some point at AFA, but is there any way, because as we have all heard, the budgeting process for 2024 starts the day after we pass the 2023 budget. And considering that gender-based budgeting is really not about dollars and cents, it's also thinking about it from a holistic service delivery perspective. So would it make sense for us to informally speak about this with our internal teams to start to have the very real conversations of what gender, how our programs, initiatives, investments affect gender?
Through the chair, I think the work we're doing around the equity, diversity, inclusion, which includes accessibility framework and education, all people leaders have had some training. So I think the gender piece is part of, is that whole process, right? Very large corporations, 7,500 staff, about 600 people leaders. So it takes a while to drill everything down. So I think that is happening in terms of looking about how we use that when we're thinking about our public engagement, when we're thinking about development of policy recommendations we bring to council or new programs, et cetera. So I think that process is kind of starting to ingrain it in terms of the thinking in the corporation. And then Mike's approach that he's mentioned for the budget. I think for us as staff, another key piece is clearly once council has that workshop and we truly understand what your priorities are as a council, that's going to help us realign where possible, where our resources are to support those new priorities. I mean, there's staff involved in making sure the water treatment plant runs and, when roads are plowed. So those resources are dedicated there. And once we have those priorities, then that gives us some time to realign what we're working on.
So to you, Chair, I think that I appreciate City Manager Smith's comment. It strikes me that there is a lot riding on our strategic priority session. It's essentially determining a North Star for this organization starting from council. So it's one of those things where I'd like to just put a finer point on this, that our strategic priority session is going to be very, very, very important. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Huang. I think everyone would agree with that statement. So where we are now is that we're going to approve the motion that we drafted on the floor here. And I'm not sure if the legislative coordinator has, oh, pardon me, I apologize. Councillor Alex Wilson wanted to speak and I didn't look in WebEx like I'm supposed to. And so now I know, and now please speak.
Thanks so much, Chair Crutch. If it's appropriate to do a comment right now as opposed to a question, it's related to the motion that we're about to move.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, we're at comments. Comment away.
Yeah, thank you. Really supportive of this project initiative goal step that we're considering taking. I think it's also, though, important that we keep in mind that we have to be very specific in how we define the terms we're using, especially when we're using large terms and frames that can be very broad in how we define success. And so I don't know if it's maybe appropriate now, but maybe this can be added to the motion or it can be kind of said. I'll kind of leave that to the will of committee. But for example, we've had a federal government that said we have a feminist prime minister and are taking a gender-based lens to some of the decisions that we make as a country. And I think there's we can see clear contradictions to that in some of the moves that are happening as well. And so we don't want to be in that place where we're saying as a city, as a corporation, as an employer of 75,000 individuals that, like we are taking these steps, we are taking these lenses, and then these contradictions become apparent in our own work as well. And so I think whether it's now and through this initial step or whether there's maybe a stage of report backs, I think this is something that would be done best rather than happening all at once through several smaller report backs or staged in, so we have some ability to provide ongoing feedback, to connect with our partners, both in the city and outside of our city who are doing work in community every day in kind of defining success at every moment along this path, and ensuring that our implementation is on track if we do decide to go in this. Some things that I'd specifically like to see part of a gendered lens or a gender-based lens is an understanding of the pay gap within our organization as well as the pay gap within our city, and how the decisions we're making impact that pay gap. So individuals are maybe making less based on both their gender, but also compounding factors. We heard mention of intersectionality earlier by one of the delegates, understanding that Black women, for example, make even less money to the dollar than comparator identities in our city right now. That's a fact that we know. How does our policy and how does this lens respond to that is something I think that's really, really important to specifically pull out, and then to include, a broader, I think, and when we hear from the YWCA talking about a gender-based lens, I think they're very much talking about that intersectional gender-based lens as well. So that's something I want to pull out. I also think that we should pull out the gendered impacts to the pandemic that have happened. We know that women are falling backwards. Women, non-binary folks, gender non-conforming individuals are falling backwards in terms of progress that's been made with gender equity in our country right now because of the pandemic, because of who is laid off, who has stayed at home, the pressures of childcare, school closures. All of these things have had compounding impacts predominantly on women in our community. And that's something that needs to be front and center in this work. And I think it's one thing to kind of slap on a label or to pink wash or some of these things. And I'm not saying that's what we were planning on doing by any means, but I'm cautioning that often these processes can result to that if we're not very intentional with how we define success. And so I'm wondering if, as we're about to draft a motion, I want to prompt committee with these thoughts and say maybe an earlier, very high level report back may actually allow us to continue to shape this process as publicly and as openly as possible, because I think doing something this big, it's so important that folks are engaged. We may also want to specifically refer some of this work to some of our advisory committees, invite them into this process. That's something we've heard time and time again when citizen advisory committees have come forward to committee, is that they'd like to be proactively reached out to about projects. I think this is a great project to proactively reach out. And the third piece is just to echo, yes, we have formal channels to do this. We also have our informal channels through that priority setting group. There's 6 people at this table right now. I'll be amending my priorities email to include this as a priority, and I'd encourage other folks to reflect on that step as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I think that staff were listening to you, and it might make sense to have some of these finer points you're making be part of a motion that actually takes some action. So right now we're not taking action, we're hearing back in a preliminary way, and I'm seeing that staff are listening to what you're saying, And so the scope of the intersectionality you spoke to in terms of talking about how we consult and how we develop a budget like this, some of the broader strokes you speak to, and some of the concerns I think you're outlining around consistency, and also just like how we understand examples we see elsewhere, like at the federal government, where there's not necessarily always congruence between what's stated and what's implied. And so I think that's something that we can take forward into the process. But if we tried to workshop that into the motion for a report back initially, I think we'd be in a disaster state. So let's maybe not do that now. But I think staff heard you, and we'll make that part of the recommendation to report back to AFNA, which of course then also allows for some more delegation, right? So allows people to come here and speak. So I think that'll be the motion. And if I can turn to Elsie Bates now for that motion, so we can vote on it, that would be wonderful. Thank you, Councillor Wilson.
So I don't have too much more than the Citizen Committee report will be referred to staff for report back to AFNA on the municipal requirements of a gender-based gender lens on the municipal budget in advance of the 2024 budget process.
I think that captures the essence, and we know it's tied to this report, so we always have the ability to see this report in the context of that, so staff understand and the comments they've received today. We already had a mover and seconder to put this. No, we haven't, actually. This is a different thing, different activity. So on this activity, can we have a mover and seconder to do that very thing? Moved by Councillor Taddison. Oh, sorry, moved by Councillor Alex Wilson, actually, who was just ahead of you, Councillor Taddison. My eyes deceived me. Seconded by Councillor Taddison. And if we could vote on that electronically. Just a moment. As clerks will prepare the vote. Oh, it's up there. I apologize. Hooray. Vote at will. Just a moment, we're just tabulating. Oh, tabulated. That vote carries 6-0. It's the theme of the meeting. So we're now going to move on to the next item in our agenda, and now we're moving into item number 10.2. And 10.2 is the Committee Against Racism Citizen Committee report respecting citizen candidates for the Hamilton Police Services Selection Committee. If that's not a mouthful, I don't know. So I'll just briefly want to introduce this before we do it. I just want to really make sure that we can get through this in a timely fashion. We have a couple of more items, and it is only 11:11, but emergency and community services does loom upon us, heavy in our hearts. It's coming up. So I want to make sure we have a chance for a break and to eat between now and then. There's a recommendation here from the Committee Against Racism, and they have a process they went through, and that recommendation is to appoint 6 people to the selection committee. That selection committee will then pick the one person that the city council that they'll be recommending the city council appoint to the Hamilton Police Services Board. That's what this is. If you wish to know the names of the 6 people, we're not going to utter them in public now, but they're in the confidential report. So that's it. That's what's happening here. If this is a process that's been going on for quite a while, you can see in the report how the process has worn itself out. If anyone wants to speak to the confidential section here, I just want to know that now, because if you want to speak to the actual 6 individuals for any reason, we'd have to do something separate. So I'm just going to look with my eyeballs. If anyone shakes their head yes, we can go to a confidential session and do that. No, no, no. So we don't have to go to the confidential land today. So then what we're going to do here is have a mover and seconder to put this report on the floor. Moved by Councillor Huang, seconded by Councillor Alex Wilson. Are there any questions on this report? I'm seeing Councillor Clark. Go ahead.
So before this report moves up to, or at the same time as it moves up to the city council approval, will the council members have access to CVs on these members, so we have an understanding as to who they are and what their life experience is and what their work experience is? Because right now all I see is names.
My very brief understanding of the process is that we delegated that authority in a kind of way. So I'm using the words delegated authority because I think it's something that's legible to all of us, right? We actually delegated all that authority to a separate group of people. I believe it was HARC, the Committee Against Racism. And what they did was they went through an interview process and they spoke to, they went through an interview process where they reviewed CVs, other kinds of things, and had the chance to ask applicants questions. And that's who we're relying on for this recommendation here today. And I don't think that we will have access to the nitty gritty. Perhaps it's become, frankly, an operational issue because we delegated that authority when council passed this in the last term of council. I can't believe I got that all right.
Maybe I'm mistaken, and I apologize if I am. I thought we have to pick now one person out of that group. What is that? Like, help me out.
Oh, so I was trying to say it before and did a bad job. So let me start again. So what's going to happen is there'll be a selection committee, and it'll be these 6 folks plus 6 members of city council will sit on a selection committee. That selection committee is going to pick the one person that will recommend to council to be on the board. So this is just step 1.
I had the 2 things backwards, and I was confused.
Elsie Bates and I had this whole conversation earlier because we were both also confused. So we're at the. Okay.
I'm good to go. Thank you.
Any other questions on the report? I'm not seeing any. So we're going to vote.
And through you, Mr. Chair, before we vote, the vote that's actually going to be before you today is not that the recommendations in the report be approved. It's been revised just ever so slightly too, and this will be up on the screen when I put up the vote rather. But the motion will be that the appointment of the citizen The appointment of the community representatives listed in the Citizen Committee report respecting citizen candidates for the Hamilton Police Services Board Selection Committee be referred to the February 22nd, 2023 council meeting for consideration. And at that time, those members will be approved and appointed.
Thank you for the clarification.
Bear with me for one moment.
By all means, for the public watching, the vote is being sent. Soon we will vote on it.
And the vote is up.
That vote carries 6-0. So we're now on our roadmap. We have made it to item 11, and that's motions. And the first item is 11.1. It's entitled Constituent Management Software. Councillor Clark, could you please introduce your motion respecting constituent management software? And it's moved by you before we do that. And if you could also just make sure you let us know who the seconder is. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, for the opportunity. This motion is moved by myself and seconded by Councillor Jeff Beattie. Constituent management software, whereas councillors and their staff are currently not provided with supported database software that helps track actionable items based on contact with constituents. Whereas information and technology staff must be directed by council to explore database software options that can be supported. Therefore, be it resolved that the information technology staff be directed to explore user-friendly database software options and report to Audit, Finance and Administration Committee with those options, complete with any costs associated with adopting such software for use by councillors and their administration staff. And if I can just speak to it very briefly. Over the years, we've been using Outlook and Excel, and that's it. And so it's really challenging as you begin to gather a larger and larger database of issues and questions. If you don't remember to go back and review that comment, you're supposed to, there's nothing helping you. And I looked at different software, I looked at Constant Contact, I looked at the one that is by Salesforce, and there's dozens of them out there. But finding one that will work with our software I was in over my head, quite frankly. And so then I reached out to IT and our clerk, and they recommended this process. So our IT people will look at all those options and then make recommendations. And hopefully we can get a software system that the city pays for automatically for the councillors. We're not taking it out of our checkbook or our credit card and being reimbursed all the time. But even just having a consistent software would help all of us maintain our records appropriately and serve our clientele, which is our customers, our constituents, much better. Thank you, sir.
Looking around for speakers, I see Councillor Huang would like to speak on this, and Councillor Beatty after Councillor Huang. Go ahead, Councillor Huang.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, to the mover. What we learned a couple of weeks ago was there's a level of privacy confidentiality. So I guess the nuts and bolts of that is, are we only looking at it in a 4-year time frame in terms of all of these databases? Or like, so will we always have to come back to this every single new term? Or how does, I'm not sure how, like the actual feasibility.
I mean, I think this is a question to staff in terms of timing about when we'd have to come back to this every term. Is that what you're saying? So you're wondering procedurally if we'd have to come back to this every term?
There's also like a confidentiality. What we heard a couple of weeks ago, where we spoke about constituent to councillor, specific councillor confidentiality, and as the councillor potentially changes in the ward, this information gets kind of like stuck in the city's infrastructure. So that's kind of my concern.
Could I just clarify to make sure that staff know exactly what you're asking? I think what you're saying is that, look, this information is owned by Councillor X while they're in office. And then if they're not in office in the following term of council, now Councillor Y comes in, and can Councillor Y have access to this thing? And if not, then every term of council, we have to go through some kind of an approval process with respect to these kinds of things. How are we going to manage that part of this in terms of the longevity of this constituency software?
Yes.
Okay, I think staff can answer that question. I see City Manager Smith is poised.
Thank you, through the chair. I think we're looking at two things. So in terms of having a tool that helps councillors during their term to collect the information, pull reports on the information, look at themes, that sort of thing, that is something that would carry over from term to term and be a tool the councillors have like any other tool. But for sure, I could envision us needing to do some policy and procedures about what happens to that data at the end of the term, because, you know, there's all the legislation and privacy around that. So I think the tool is one thing, and then the policies and procedures around the tool. But we wouldn't need separate motions for the next new term of council, et cetera.
That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Seems like everybody understands what the issue is there, and it's a separate issue, and we can deal with that in the context of this, obviously. The next on the speakers list is... No, there's more speakers. No, it's okay. It's my job, not yours. Don't worry about it. It's totally fine. Councillor Beatty, you're up next, and then Councillor Alex Wilson.
Thank you, Chair Crutch, and through you, just want to make sure that I'm in the comments stage and not in the question stage. I don't want to get wrapped up in my enthusiasm again.
Yeah, I think that was a question for staff. Let's just see if Councillor Wilson has a question for staff.
Absolutely,
and if you have a question,
thank you.
No, Councillor Wilson also has just a comment, so go right ahead, Councillor Beatty.
Thank you. As a seconder of this motion, very happy that Councillor Clark has brought this forward. I think that many of us are looking for ways to add efficiency, trackability, accountability, and anticipate future demands within our roles. And I think that this aligns very nicely with commitments that I have made publicly to my community to move forward in a more approachable, efficient, transparent, and accountable way. And I'm sure that many of us around the table are of a similar view, so very happy to support this and see this come back in an expedient fashion.
Okay, thank you so much for your comment. Councillor Alex Wilson.
Thank you. Similarly, I'm supportive of the motion today. I do want to just flag that I think as this process comes on later, I think at some points just flagging for committee and members, I think I'll speak against at later stages this being a universal or automatic opt-in process. Just because I think it really is up to folks to come up with systems that work for them. I've used a lot of constituency management softwares as a constituency worker over the years, and there can definitely be pros and cons to different systems. And I think finding a system that works for the community is ultimately what's best. And so feeling like we have a system that works right now with the tools we have in Ward 13, happy to have conversations with folks about what we're doing with the tools we have. I support other councillors in trying to get the support they need and build the systems they want. So definitely in support of this motion today. Just want to flag that I think especially as we look at like the cost to benefit, my support of the implementation may be different than my support of the investigation, but very, very excited to move forward with this at this moment.
Thanks so much. And we have a second time speaker. If there's no other first time speakers, and Councillor Clark.
Thank you. And just to clarify a few things, my motion, I'm not suggesting that one software would be used by all. I'm suggesting that they come back and look at some options, and you could do this, you could do this, and these all work with our computer system with no issues. I'd also like to suggest that the ideal situation, I think, would be if I get constant contact, just as, and I'm not promoting it, Chair, I'm just saying as an example, if I get constant contact, it would be a password protected software that would indicate Office of Councillor Clark, and all records would be to that Office of Councillor Clark, and there would be passwords for my staff, but we protect passwords because we have to protect the anonymity and confidentiality of the constituents who have responded to me. So it's not an access system where the entire city staff would be able to see these things. We still have to follow MFIPA and ensure that the records that I'm dealing with remain in my office unless my constituent has agreed that I can share that record with staff. And so that's my intent, and I hope it helps clear up some questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think that does help a little bit. I'll add, if Councillor Twang would take the chair, I just want to add one comment to this as well, very briefly. To say, I think one thing we have to be mindful of in all this is to this idea of ownership. And so the experience I had coming into the Ward 2 office was there wasn't a Ward 2 at hamilton.ca set up. I thought that there was, and I was like trying to get access to it, but it didn't exist. And so what happens to that thing, right? And what happens, and the thing I think is like that should stay with the Ward office, and then people who come in next can access those records and should be able to access them, so there's some continuity. If everything's attached to me as a person and my staff as individuals, it's just like hitting a reset button. And I just want to share with everyone, it has been incredibly painful to try to recreate everything. Many of us are in that situation. Not everybody's talking about it publicly like I am, but the point is many of us are in the situation where we're trying to reconstruct a past decision with literally no information whatsoever and relying heavily on staff. And what this does, unfortunately, I think also, is puts a huge amount of pressure on our staff. So now I'm spending an extraordinary amount of time meeting with people and sending emails to people, and they're then having to report back to me about the history of something they just went through 6 months ago. It's like, how is that an effective use of their time? It's not. And it's frankly probably very irritating. But I have no other recourse because I got nothing. So I think that's also something to think about in this process is really about, yes, there are privacy concerns, but we have to manage those in a way that is reasonable and effective. So thanks for bringing this forward. I think we're going to get there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Back to you, Chair.
Thanks, and we're going to vote on this now. It's electronic vote time, everybody. Great, that carries 6-0, and I'd like to turn the chair over to Councillor Huang now, as I'm going to introduce a motion I've got going.
Councillor Crutch, please introduce your motion respecting council access and copies of confidential records. Moved by Councillor Crutch, seconded by,
Looking for a seconder. I didn't unfortunately plan this in advance and have to ask for a seconder.
Councillor Alex Wilson, seconded by Councillor Alex Wilson. Is there any, please present that today.
Yeah, so we all have this before us. It's on the agenda in terms of the whereas clauses. Actually, I'd like to suggest, and this is a surprise and I realize that, but I'd like to suggest doing something different than I propose here. I'll be brief. I'd like to refer this actually to staff to report back on. The reason I say that is because in the context of having an agenda review discussion, and in the context of there being an actual governance review subcommittee now, which there was not before when I first contemplated this, it might actually be useful for staff to have a look at this, report back to governance review subcommittee, or here, I don't know where actually, because we haven't actually constituted the governance review subcommittee yet, and so I don't know what the flavor is over there, to be fair, although I've visited many times. I assume this could go there, or here. And I think that makes more sense now that it exists. So we can, because I realize that in my context of the conversations I've had in agenda review, there's a lot of discussion that is going to come out of this. And if we do it verbally, my worry is like it's going to get lost. And if staff have a chance to actually report back on it, we could review that information, which might be. Again, I didn't realize that there was going to be this much discussion on it. I think it might be valuable to see it in writing. Certainly for me, from an accessibility perspective, I think it would be. And so that's where I'm standing on this now. If that's okay with folks, I'll leave it there.
To LC Bates, we would change the existing motion to what Councillor Crutch is recommending, and then have a discussion on that new. Can he amend his own motion?
He can withdraw his motion and refer it to governance, to staff for report back to governance committee on the matter.
Okay. So then, is that what you would like to do, Councillor Crutch?
Yeah, I think if I do that, that kills the speakers list, though. I don't know if Councillor Clark wanted to speak to this, or if it's okay if I do that. You wanted to go ahead? I just don't want to interfere in that. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd be happy to withdraw my motion and refer it to staff to report back at the governance review subcommittee.
Okay. So
On March 27th.
Pulling it off now and then referring it to staff to bring back to the governance subcommittee on March 27th, correct?
Yes, that is what I am typing.
Okay, then we don't need to vote on it, correct? We still have to vote on, we have to vote on the retraction? No? The whole thing. We're going to vote on the whole thing. Maybe Clerk Collin looks like?
Yes, Yes, the date of the meeting is March 27th. Yes, if I wouldn't mind the clerk weighing in on the exact process for this. Thank you.
Through the chair, given the tight timeline to be able to report back, and that we would have to have the report to clerks in 2 weeks, it'd be kind of tight to formulate that response. It would probably be the following governance review subcommittee. Okay. So in the motion, if you could just put a future.
Could we just say the one after March 27th? Is that also okay? Just so we know it's the next one, whatever that may be, because it meets so infrequently, right? That's my only concern.
Sure. I'm not sure if the next one's been scheduled, but sure. Yep.
Yes, I don't know if the next one has been scheduled. I believe they meet at the call of the chair, so it could be at any time.
Yeah, and I think that's at the March 27th meeting. Correct?
That would be
okay.
Yeah.
So just to clarify, we are retracting this. We are asking staff to review. We are having them to come back to the meeting following the first governance subcommittee, just so that I'm clear, having this particular motion.
That is the intention, yes.
Okay, and then do I have any speakers to this? Councillor Clark?
So I guess instructions more than anything. I'd like to have as clear as possible, which with government legislation sometimes is not that clear at all. But for returning counselors and new counselors, everybody should be getting the same documentation that clearly outlines what is permitted and what's not permitted. And if it's not permitted, how can we appeal it? And it's been, I mean, I've been on this road for a long time fighting these issues. And the challenge is what the decision of the Information and Privacy Commissioner makes is binding on all municipalities. And so we need to understand those decisions so that we know exactly what, because I know where the good counselor is. I've been going down that road, and I understand the process and policies now, but it was only after many attempts at discussions with the clerk. But if we could have that in writing for us with that review, it would really be helpful, I think, to the new council members. Does that make sense through you to the chair or to the clerk?
Through the chair, yes.
Super. Thank you very much.
All right, so are there any other speakers to this? Elsie Bates, are we ready to vote on this?
So I have the mover as Councillor Crutch, and I just need a seconder.
Councillor A. Wilson.
A. Wilson on the referral?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, the vote is up. Okay, and that carries. Thank you very much, all. And back to you. Sorry? I'm keeping it. Wait, do I have a motion here too? Oh, I'm item 12. Okay. No, what? Well, this was a notice of motion before, and now this is...
You can ignore that for the moment. If we're moving on to 12.1 right now, which is a notice of motion from Councillor Crutch. So Councillor Huang, you still have the chair.
Okay. This is also 12.1. Okay, all right. Sorry, thank you. Moving on to notices of motion, item 12, 12.1, feasibility of bringing your own device policy. Councillor Crutch, would you please introduce your notice of motion respecting feasibility of a bring your own device policy?
Yes, thank you. And this is a notice of motion. I don't intend to change it, transform it from a notice to anything else. So it would appear on the next AFNA agenda as a motion. It's just primarily to ask IT staff to investigate the feasibility of implementing a bring your own device policy that would allow councillors and their staff to use personal computers, mobile phones, and other personal devices to conduct City of Hamilton business. Right now, it's not permitted to do so. And so I think that I'll just be brief in saying a few things. I don't want to really go too far with this, but just to say that, because it's a notice, we're not debating the motion, there's no debate. But, you know, we have the kinds of computers we have. And there are other kinds of devices and computers that can help us do our job. And so some of those things are better suited to graphic design, for instance, or better suited to certain kinds of applications that we might find helpful in our constituency work, web design, whatever it might be. And as we are doing more digital work and reaching people in different ways, some of the devices we have are, frankly, maybe not providing the right accessibility needs, maybe not providing the right technological needs, maybe not being as efficient as we might want to have them. And right now we're kind of locked into a certain model for what we're using, and there's not a lot of flexibility there. So the goal of this is to say, hey, what can we do? What can we modify here? What are some of the permissions and ways to prevent there being any impact to the organization? So I'll give one brief example and then end my thing. For instance, what if somebody wanted to bring in a Mac laptop or a Mac to do graphic design, which is like widely known to be a thing that people use in the industry, and frankly, it's not as if the city owns zero Mac equipment, I'll just say. So the idea is that, you know, how we protect the network from that, right? So how do you do that city business, but still protect the network from any attacks? So you'd have a standalone device that wasn't allowed to connect to the network, for instance, as an example of how you could do this, right? So these are the kinds of things I think it's important for us to think about as an organization, because a one-size-fits-all in terms of constituency work and for councillors isn't really gonna, I don't think, going down the road be something that's effective and useful. So I think we need to have a policy that allows us to have more of a hybridized understanding of the devices and technology we use and how we can find a way to bring that in here without creating a cybersecurity risk with our insurance. So that's it, and I'll see you next time about it for a debate.
Thank you, Councillor Crutch. I will pass the chair back to you, but I also have this.
Thank you so much, Councillor Huang. I'm going to look at my roadmap, which is about the I think that might be about something entirely that Elsie Bates will come over and speak to you about that thing separately. But we're on to item 13, which are the amendments to the outstanding business list. This will signal to everybody in the room we're approaching the end. And so amendments to the outstanding business list are before you. Just one second. I need a mover and a seconder to put the amendments to the outstanding business list on the floor. I see Councillor Taddison, and then I see Councillor Huang on that. So mover and Councillor Taddison, secondary Councillor Huang. Any discussion on the amendments to the outstanding business list? None. Okay, we're going to have an electronic vote to amend them, the business list. And that carries 6-0. And I think if I'm following this correctly, the next item is item 15, which is adjournment. And so could I have, before I do that, Elsie Bates, when is the next meeting of AFNA?
The next meeting of AFNA is March 25th, I believe, is the Thursday.
I don't know. Let's just double check. I just want to make sure.
It is the end of March. 23rd.
Great, okay.
March 23rd.
Thank you. So can I have a mover and a seconder to adjourn? Moved by Councillor Huang, seconded by Councillor Taddison. Those are the winners of that race. Councillor Alex Wilson, I'm sorry. and all those in favor, there will be an electronic vote.
Sorry, was it Huang and Taddison?
It was. Bit of a nail biter here, I think. Okay, Councillor Beattie is voting in favor. And that is carried 6-0. We will see you all again for the Audit, Finance, and Administration Committee, March 23rd. Thanks so much. Have a great day, everyone.